Welcome to the Backup and Thriving Accessible Travel podcast. My name is Sophie Elwes, and I'm the host for this series. I sustained a spinal cord injury myself back in 2011 and have a T4 complete injury, and I work as head of services at Backup. Over this series, I'll be interviewing a range of guests who all are affected by spinal cord injury, and each episode will look at a different mode of transport. Guests will be sharing their stories, their travel experiences, as well as some fabulous advice. Our hope is that listeners will realise that travelling after spinal cord injury is not only possible, but that it can be life-changing too. Hi, Merryn. Welcome to the Backup podcast. Great to have you here.
Hi, Sophie. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So let's dive straight in. My first question to you is tell me about your journey to Backup and how you got here.
Great, thanks. Well, it feels like it's been quite a long journey now. I had my injury in 2009, right at the end of 2009, so going into Christmas when I was 18, when I had a blood vessel burst in my spinal cord in my neck while I was, interestingly, on public transport, which I know is what we're going to be speaking about today. I was sat on a train between Reading and my home in Cornwall when, out of the blue, I had a terrific pain in my neck that went on to cause some pins and needles go down my body, and before I knew it, I couldn't walk or move. So quite an unusual injury, from what I understand, and at quite an unusual location, both in terms of where it happened in my neck, but also where it happened in the world. It's not every day you're sat on a train and then you walk on it, but you don't walk off it, you get stretchered off it. But also having an injury at the time that was classed at about a complete C6, turns out it was actually more of a complete T1, C8, and incomplete up to C6 with swelling and bleeding. But I always thought that was quite an unusual level and never really saw other people being on that brink between T and tetra and para when I was in the early days. So hopefully others can hear this and hear the nuances of being at that level and know that there are still things you can absolutely do and achieve and complete with that level of injury. But yeah, my journey into Backup really started when I was injured and meeting, or just after I was injured, when I met an outreach and support coordinator in my spinal unit in Salisbury. It would have been the lovely Michael, who came in to talk to us about life post-injury, about how you can get on with anything you want to do, whether that's just going back to work or education or going and doing amazing things like travelling and getting super into sports. The world is your oyster. Backup also came and taught us some wheelchair skills, and from there I went on a course in the Lake District when I was at home before I went back to university. So yeah, that is my journey. And actually it didn't even stop there.
That's just a start, right?
Yeah, I ended up really getting involved as a volunteer, starting out working with young people, which was so rewarding, becoming a wheelchair skills trainer, as well as a group leader, and working at Backup myself in the courses team.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. You said, what year was that in, did you say?
It was 2009 when I was 18.
Yeah. Wow.
Super young. I'm 32 now. I feel like I was just a baby.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I know what you mean actually about that sort of level of injury, that sort of midway. It is quite unusual. I haven't come across that many people. It's kind of not necessarily tetra nor para. You're kind of somewhere in the middle, right?
I always kind of described myself as a very fake tetra, but not a para either. You know, my hands work quite well. When I was first injured, my hands were paralysed, but I was able to regain some movement just due to the nature of my injury. It wasn't through trying hard or praying hard. It was just because my injury allowed it, because I had an incomplete lesion between about C8 and C6. So I was able to regain some hand function, but I have absolutely no core strength to speak of whatsoever. And it's an interesting in the middle, because whilst outwardly I look kind of para, I always felt that there was an expectation to be super independent and super able to do all my transfers and everything in between, but that because there was still that quite high level nature to my injury, that wasn't necessarily always the case for me. So I lapped up any content from anyone who had a similar level of injury and was always so fascinated by that.
Yeah. That's why it's so important, isn't it, to actually speak to someone who, kind of the nature of mentoring, it's actually being matched with someone who's a similar level, mentoring a backup, who's ideally the same level as you, who can really appreciate what you might be going through physically anyway.
Definitely, it's so important.
Yeah, awesome. So it feels kind of almost poignant, that you had your injury actually on a train, because like you say, today we're going to talk a little bit about public transport. I know I'm really pleased to be talking to you about this, because I know that you're a big user of public transport, more than anyone I know, and I know a fair few people out there with spinal cord injuries. So take me back to when you first started using public transport. Were you worried, and what were those worries about?
Yeah, I was worried. Absolutely. I think as a disabled person, especially as a wheelchair user, I think even more specifically, we hear a lot of horror stories about public transport, about getting left on trains, planes, buses, you name it. There's issues that come along with those things, and often those are the louder stories that we hear. And as is completely natural in all storytelling in life, we hear the negatives, but we don't hear the day-to-day mundane things working and going as they should. And in saying this, I'm not saying that the negatives don't exist, because they absolutely do. Unfortunately, there are things that don't go to plan, and I have been left on a train before and had to wait a long time to get off a plane, but that is such a small minority of the time. And, I live in London now, which means driving around is pretty hectic. It's stressful finding parking spaces, and it's just not a very enjoyable way of getting around. So I choose to use the tube to get to work, to socialise, to do anything that I might want to do to live my life in London as a 30-something-year-old. And it works for me, day to day, it just goes. There aren't any massive dilemmas. There aren't big hoo-has about things going wrong on the whole. Of course they happen. Just like anyone using TfL experiences blips, I of course do as a wheelchair user, probably more so. But day to day, I hop on the tube, I hop off the tube, I go to work, I hop on a bus, I hop off a bus, and I'm there at the pub with my friends and not having to worry about my car. So I'm a real passionate advocate for people getting more confident using public transport. It's there. It's a really great tool for living a great life as a wheelchair user, as a disabled person, just getting out and about.
Love that. And I think that people listening who maybe haven't used public transport will want to know kind of what that actually looks like. Can you talk us through perhaps like using a bus, for example, like how that works for a wheelchair user?
Yeah, for sure. And I'd say it varies according to where you're from. So in London, it's pretty swift as an experience. The bus, obviously, you start off by going to the bus stop, as everyone does. They're all accessible around London, and you see the bus that you want coming along. What I like to do is have some kind of eye contact or signal with the driver so they've seen me, whether that's putting my hand out or just making eye contact, so you know for sure that that bus driver knows you want to get on that bus. They will then put out the ramp, which is automatic, and you can board the bus. Depending on the height of the curb, you may or may not need some help. I tend to be pretty okay at getting up all the ramps. They don't tend to be that steep, but every now and then it'll just be a quick hi to a stranger, do you mind giving me a hand up this ramp? And that's something I've had to become comfortable with. Just from time to time, like I said, it's a bit of a rarity. Maybe sometimes if I'm carrying some luggage, the ramp will be a bit much. So that's London, and it's all quite automatic. And when you then want to get off the bus, you press the bell there's a separate bell for wheelchair users that makes an extra little noise to the bus driver to signify you want to get off the bus. And the ramp will get deployed. I found that in other towns and cities across the UK, the buses have slightly different systems, just where they might not have an automatic ramp, and it'll just be one that the driver has to unfold when he stops. In a way, that's actually better because you know it's always going to work. There's no such thing as a failure with the electronics. Plus, it's at the same door as everyone else is entering, so there's no worry about the driver not having seen you. It's just a different way of doing things.
That's a good way of looking at it. I wonder, I mean, you've talked about in London and across the UK as well. What about being abroad? I know that you've spent a lot of time abroad. You've lived abroad since your injury, really early on. Tell us a little bit about actually living abroad. I think that would be interesting. But also, presumably, you used public transport. Did you have a car when you were there as well? Lots of questions.
Yeah. Lots of questions. Okay, so first one to attack is living abroad. I think we'll start there. Yeah, how I always describe this kind of period of my life as a bit of a bullish. I was in my bullish phase. I wasn't thinking things through particularly hard. I'd gone to university about a year after my injury, maybe a year and a half, to study languages. So originally I wanted to study music, but my injury meant I could no longer play my instruments. So I changed path a little bit and found myself going to Reading Uni to study French and Italian. And even when I applied, I knew there was a year abroad involved, but that was very much a 2 years' time Merryn's problem rather than a right there and then problem. It was something I kind of thought, I'll deal with it when I get there. I'll have figured it out by then. And, you know, the time came and I was like, I'm not sure I have figured this out by now, but we're going to do it because it's part of my degree. We'll find a way. And at the time, I actually had carers coming in. And this was the biggest complication I had. Because the care I had wasn't 24-hour. I wasn't employing carers. It was very much health and social, 2 hours in the morning. So there's no way of really transferring that and taking that with you. So I think for me and for the disability coordinators at my university, it was a really big headache, you know, how that was going to be supplied in a different country with different rules. And the solution that was presented to me was to just employ carers when I got there. And that massively did not appeal because it's already a strange country. I mean, it's only France and Italy. They're not terrifying countries, but at the time it felt that way. And I didn't fancy the idea of extra admin employing carers. And as I've already said, my level of injury is a weird one because you're really close to certain types of independence, but equally it can feel very far when you've got used to having carers. So I had carers coming in to help me wash and dress and with any continence stuff in the morning. And I thought, God, I really feel like I should be able to do these things. I would be seeing people with a higher level of injury than me able to do these things. So I got in touch with my spinal unit. And at the time, it was possible for me to go back in and basically learn how to do these things and learn a way to do these things that worked for me. For me, I think the biggest one was bowel care and transferring onto shower chairs. And just some little tips and tricks with that. Like for me, swapping, using suppositories, using microenemas meant I could become completely independent with my bowel care. And because that was where I couldn't grip a slippery enema, I could grip a little plastic tube. And that was a huge game changer, but it was such a small switch. And I remember speaking to a friend who had a high level injury than me about how she did shower chair transfers. And she said, well, I just transfer with my PJs on, getting into the shower, so I'm nice and slidey. And then to get out the shower again, I put a layer of baby oil on my transfer board, so it's nice and slippy, because everyone knows that wet skin sticks to a transfer board. So again, a little game-changing tip and trick that totally changed how I could live, and getting rid of carers. And, if you need carers, you need carers. But sometimes there are things we can do to allow ourselves a bit more freedom. And like I said, just with my certain level of injury, it was possible. So happily I was able to do it.
That's really amazing. I never knew that.
Ditched the carers.
I mean, different times as well, I think, back then with the
Definitely.
spinal unit as well, wasn't it? I'm not sure that's an option at the moment, but, hopefully, as in to go back into the spinal unit and have that additional rehab, but hopefully things will come through.
But then on the flip side, I would say there's probably also local community options to look at with that. So continence nurses in the community or locally can also support with that kind of thing with input from spinal centres. So I know, for example, Salisbury have an on-call system for medical practitioners. So I would imagine this is the same across a lot of other spinal centres. But if you go to the GP and they have questions about managing your care as someone with spinal cord injury, they can call a dedicated number to speak to someone at a spinal unit to get their advice.
Oh, wow.
Which is a great way of connecting the community care with the spinal unit care.
Definitely. And another thing comes to mind for those who might want that sort of additional kind of rehab. Can you read my mind, what I'm thinking of, particularly course at Backup?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have you done that course? Tell us about that.
The Skills for Independence one. I didn't do Skills for Independence as a participant, have done it as group leader. And I mean, I would say all of the courses are a really good way of just gaining some day-to-day skills and independence. Obviously, it's in the title for Skills for Independence. But, for example, I went on the Lake District course, and I kind of laugh looking back on it now because I find putting my shoes on so basic and easy, but I was so adamant I couldn't do it when I went on that course, and I needed help to put my shoes on, and that was just that. But I saw other people doing it, and I was like, oh, well, he's just put his own trainer on. I wonder if I could try that. And lo and behold, this guy's way of putting a trainer on was totally doable by me as well, even with my slightly rubbish hands. And that, again, just saved me from having to find someone to do these things for me, and just so many little things. But yeah, so with something like the multi-activity course, I would say it's more passive learning. So you're learning through the activities. So you might be abseiling or rock climbing or whatever, but you're learning transfer skills because you want to do that activity. And you're learning other skills just getting around the centre. Whereas the brilliant thing about the Skills for Independence course is that you can go in with specific goals and say you want to go on the course and get better at transferring into a bath because you know you're going to have to go on holiday where the only option is using a bath. That can be worked on the course. And that's the nice bit there. It's a bit more targeted.
Yeah. I'm nodding because I went on a course a few years back. I was planning on doing this big trip to go skiing for a good long while. And I went on the Moving Forwards course. I was 25 or 26, and it's usually up to 25, but they gave me a spot on it. And I went there with very clear objectives, mainly that I wanted to improve my wheelchair skills, but also learn how to do a bath transfer, because I knew in the States they have a lot of baths. And so that's what I did, and that's what I got out of it. And now I have a bath. It's not a wheelchair accessible bathroom. I couldn't advertise it as such, but yeah, I wouldn't think twice about it now. It's funny, isn't it, what you said before as well about those things that we just totally take for granted years down the line, like putting on shoes, and I mean, learning to get dressed, putting trousers on. I remember learning how to do that for the first time and just thinking, my God, no way, this is not something that I can do like at all, even let alone regularly, kind of thing. But yeah, times change, don't they? And perspective changes.
And it's amazing to look back on those things that now seem so simple, but when you do them for the first time, you feel like you've climbed Mount Everest or something. I remember getting on and off the sofa for the first time, I think a year or so down the line, and thinking, oh my God, I've just done the most amazing thing, and it's going to open so many doors. Yeah. And it is magic, really. Yeah, and I still 100%. Get those moments, even.
Oh, me too.
So far down the line, they don't
big time.
Stop.
Me too, big time. And you've got to like recognize them as that. I think that's important
for sure.
Speaking of opening doors, tell me about your experiences of public transport while you were abroad, and more broadly as well since then as well.
So I will. And so the two places that I studied abroad, when I lived abroad, I was in Grenoble in France for the French half of my year abroad. Although I always feel very English saying Grenoble. It's the French say like Grenoble, but you do sound like a bit of a twit for saying that in England. And then I was in Florence in Italy for the Italian part of my year abroad. And I did use public transport in both places, and I have used it other times I've been abroad. It's something I actually quite enjoy is having a go at public transport in different places. And some of them come out better than London, some of them don't come out better than London. But yeah, in Grenoble, I actually went there because I Googled the most accessible city in France, and it came second or something. And it was because it was on the list of universities we could go to. So I was like, right, I'm going there. I'm going to make my life as easy as possible. Had a wonderful set of flatmates who were French, and I couldn't understand for quite a lot of the time I was there. But actually they were super lovely, and they had such an accessible tram network there. And that's the thing that really blew my mind, was that you could have this just amazing network that's open to everyone, and that's the main way people get around, yet it is fully accessible. And so it's in environments like that, when you're just using exactly the same method of transport as anyone else, there's nothing different to it. And it's in those environments you really don't feel that disabled, because shock horror, when the environment is accessible, there's what's different, you know. It's just harking back to the social model of disability if we're going to get scientific about it. But I truly believe that it is a lot of the time, if not all of the time, inaccessibility that disables us. And perhaps there are some kind of outliers there, but that's my general belief. But yeah, trams are a huge tick, yes. Also a lot of buses. I found in France, most buses were accessible. Italy was interesting. Florence in particular was really interesting, because I didn't really use transport that much there, because I was lucky enough to find a vaguely accessible flat right in the centre. It's a really pedestrian city. So actually, no one was using public transport for the majority of the time. If I needed to go out of town a little bit, I'd find a bus. And I learnt very quickly that I had to get au fait with the vocab. So learn the right words for the ramp, like how to say, I need the ramp, please. And if you're in Italy, you can't be shy about it. You probably have to shout it at some point. And the word for wheelchair, really important. And just little bits like how to say, I need to get off. I need this, I need that. These are things that I would really recommend people do if they are going to a foreign country or a non-English speaking country. Just learn little bits of vocab that are going to help with things like that. In a wider sense, I did use trains quite a lot to get around both the countries, and found them to be great, to be honest, in terms of physical access. In terms of the soft access, sometimes there was room for improvement. I think at the time, hopefully it's improved a bit by now. I think there's actually more in the way of apps and online booking for these things. But at the time, they had slightly archaic systems in place where you had to book 24 hours in advance, or else they just wouldn't get the ramp for you. But yeah, so change happens. But access on the trains was all kind of great in general.
We have an episode coming up talking about train specifically, so we'll cover that in more detail in another one. But it's kind of a big question, really, because it's it's been a long time of travelling by public transport. But what would you say this experience of travelling like this has taught you?
Oh, that's a good question. I look back on myself when I was newly injured and I was quite shy, and anyone that knows me now might giggle a bit at that, but I was quite quiet and maybe a bit ashamed of my disability or embarrassed by it. And that took some time to heal and come away from, and meeting other people with spinal cord injury was huge in that. But I think becoming more comfortable with using public transport has made me much more confident. Just A, getting out and about, but B, using my voice and feeling able to say, nope, this is what I need. And bus driver, you need a ramp that works. And if you don't, why the hell are you running your bus right now? Luckily, that's not a daily occurrence. But things like just being able to speak up and say, actually, I need help with this ramp. Do you mind giving me a push? And being able to instruct someone to safely do that has been huge. And being able to have firm but fair conversations with platform staff. If I need a ramp and they're telling me I've not got enough time, there's a real power in standing your ground, but being able to use your voice and assertiveness to say, actually, no, we do have time. Can we please give it a go? And my right as a wheelchair user is to be able to turn up and go and use a train. And you're at the moment blocking me. But doing it in a friendly way that is confident without being aggressive, or I don't know the right word for it. But yeah, there's just a nice balance, I think. That's what I've learned. And it's made me a lot more confident in myself, but also in getting around. I think once you've done these things a few times, then you're like, oh, yes, I can do anything.
I love that. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that, for sure. Especially with spinal cord injury. I think once you've done something, I still get a bit of a kick getting on the tube or whatever. Less so now, because I do use it a lot more now than I used to. But when I started using it more, far too late in the day, I would still really get such a massive kick out of travelling right across London and leaving my car behind and stuff.
Oh my God. I mean, I remember, so it was while I was studying at Reading, I used to come into London from time to time. And the fear that I used to feel initially, and just this fear of not having control. So I would always just be hyper planning. I'd be like, right, you need to know whether this station is going to be accessible, this station. But when I came home after a day of using the tube, I'd be like, oh, look at me go. I'm the most accomplished person on the planet right now. Yeah. And no one can stop me. And so I do understand the fear of these things. And that little gap between the platform and the train, even though it's tiny and there's no chance you could ever fall down it, it feels absolutely huge. So the fear is real, and it's only really practice that can help get through that and get over it, and knowing you've done it. And also knowing that you've faced obstacles as well, knowing that you've come up against a lift being out of order, but you've found a way around it, and still being able to get on with your day, even if it was annoying. Then once you've done that, you know that that's like the worst thing that can happen.
Love that. That's amazing. So, to those people who might be feeling that fear, you've already given quite a lot of advice in what you've said so far, but what advice specifically would you give to someone who maybe hasn't travelled by public transport at all before? Say they're newly injured, out of hospital, been a few months, and they're wanting to take that step. What advice would you give them?
I'd say start small and take someone with you. When I say small, it really can be getting on a bus, going 2 stops and getting off the bus, just to give it a go. Taking someone you trust with you, so that if things do go to pot, then you've always got backup. I remember being in the spinal unit and being able to go out and use the buses there to go into Salisbury. That was a good way of just easing myself into public life, but also the challenge of getting around and getting used to that. More often than not, I'd have a family member with me, a friend, or even a member of staff back in the days where they'd let nurses go into town with you. I'm not sure they do that now either. But that was all building up this little portfolio of experiences. Even though it was just small, I was learning how to do it and that I could do it. So when I got home, I was able to have a go at getting trains and buses in Cornwall, which, let me tell you, are more challenging than in Salisbury. But again, very doable. And then with all those experiences under my belt, when I moved up to Reading and then London, I already had those just in my back pocket to remind myself that I'd done it once, I could do it again, I could keep trying, and all of these things. So yeah, the other thing I would say is do a degree of planning. Whilst I haven't always been the best planner, my year abroad is a case in point. I would say definitely when you're starting to get out and about, if it's going to help your confidence, plan and over plan. But accept that at some point there's a case for just jumping in and giving it a go. I was saying this to a friend the other day, but when I first started going away, when I was newly injured, I would take the whole world with me. You know, I would be packing millions of bags for a 2-night stay, just in case. Like, just in case this happens, just in case that happens. The kitchen sink was in there. And now I can happily go away with a backpack for 2 nights. And it's fine. But again, that all just comes with experience and knowing what you actually need, and also knowing what you could get hold of where you're going if anything were to happen. So maybe you can leave the kitchen sink at home.
Love that. Makes so much sense, I think. Okay, so I've got 3 final questions to ask you. I'll ask them one at a time. The first one, you've done a lot of travelling. I wonder, what is your top travel memory, perhaps?
I think, I mean, it's a good question, because there's travel within the UK and then there's travel abroad, isn't there? And I think all travel comes with wonderful, wonderful memories. I'd say one that sticks out for me is a trip that I made just before COVID, where I just sort of took off and did a bit of a train around a few European countries. So I got the Eurostar to Amsterdam, and then the train from Amsterdam to Germany, Germany to Vienna, Vienna to Zurich, Zurich to Paris, and Paris to London again. And it was somewhat meticulously planned out in terms of an itinerary, but then a storm blew in while I was in Amsterdam that screwed up my carefully planned itinerary, and I had to find an emergency hotel in Dusseldorf where I'd not been planning on staying. And I felt so proud of myself when I'd done that trip. It was by myself. I didn't take anyone with me. And it was just the most wonderful time of introspection, is that the word? And reading and exploring and having a lovely time, having coffee by myself without having to answer to anyone else. But more so that I'd been able to adapt my plans, even with access needs. And actually, to some extent, I think having access needs even helped, because when it was chaos at Amsterdam Station, I had a dedicated member of staff with me who could steer me to the right place. Not literally, I don't like being pushed, but metaphorically. And there are little perks sometimes and little helpful things. And it all worked out.
Yeah.
It was all, and I got to see an extra city. It was kind of all fine. So even though that was a solo trip, I think that one really sticks out.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm all for a solo trip too. It's amazing. I think it would be inspiring for people to hear that as well, you know.
And
Very
it was
cool.
scary. I'll say that. I remember there being several moments before I went where I thought, what the hell am I doing this? This will surely all end badly, but guess what? It was brilliant, and I totally recommend it.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've given us lots of fabulous tips about travelling. What would you say, travelling more broadly, it doesn't have to be just public transport, what is your top tip for listeners about travelling with a spinal cord injury?
Just do it, I think.
Yeah.
With the caveat of also doing a little bit of planning and blah, blah, blah. But I do think when we have a spinal cord injury, and I've seen it in myself, I see it a lot in other people, it can be really scary, but it that can then lead us to overplan and overthink. And actually, sometimes there's something to be said for just kind of jumping in and seeing what happens, and knowing that worst case scenario probably isn't as bad as you think it could be. Yeah.
Do the thing.
Yeah, do the thing. Say yes more, and just have a go. Worst things worst, you fly home and you chalk it up to experience. Yeah. But best case scenario, you see amazing things, you meet amazing people, and you have a bloody great time. So
love it.
So yeah, more to gain than to lose, I think.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm looking forward to this one, actually. Final question. What is your top tip for living well with a spinal cord injury, just more broadly?
So similar, actually, is I would say just do it and say yes more. And don't let the fear of kind of things going wrong stop you from having a go. A huge one for me, and I know probably for you as well, was meeting other people with spinal cord injury. It can be something a lot of people are quite hesitant to do when you're newly injured, especially if you kind of, like I did, suffer with a degree of internalised ableism. You maybe don't want to be seen with other disabled people, but as soon as you get involved, you realise you've been missing out on this whole community of people that are not only brilliant people, but have so much to offer in terms of advice and making the most out of your own life. And as I've gone beyond 30, I now find myself thinking of making the best of what I'm able to do while I can. So I think that would also be in there somewhere of enjoying your ability. Like, if you're injured, go and do things. Enjoy what you can do while you can. And that's not to say that we become totally unable to do anything as we age, but you notice the aches and pains. I'll say that.
Amen to that. Thank you so much. That's beautiful advice, and I'm sure our listeners will really get a lot from it, because I know that I have. Thank you so much for being a guest on the Backup Podcast. It's been wonderful to have you, Merryn.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Backup and Thriving Accessible Travel Podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please do give us a rating, review, and subscribe or follow on Spotify, because this helps us reach more people that might enjoy or even benefit from listening. See you next time.